to another edition of Railfan Robert's Reading Railroad. Tonight, the Hardy Boys in The Tower Treasure. Chapter 1, The Speed Demon. Frank and Joe Hardy clutched the grips of their motorcycles and stared in horror at the oncoming car. It was careening from side to side on the narrow road. "He'll hit us! We better climb this hillside, and fast!" Frank exclaimed as the boys brought their motorcycles to a screeching halt and leapt off. "On the double!" Joe cried out as they stared up the steep embankment. To their amazement, the reckless driver suddenly pulled his car hard to the right, turned into a side road on two wheels. The boys expected the car to turn over, but it held the dusty ground and sped off out of sight. "Wow," said Joe. "Let's get away from here before that crazy guy comes back. That's a dead-end road, you know." The boys scrambled back on their motorcycles and gunned them a bit to get past the intersecting road in a hurry. Then they rode in silence for a while, gazing at the scene ahead. On their right, an embankment of tumbled rocks and boulders sloped steeply to the water below. From the opposite side rose a jagged cliff. The little-traveled road was winding and just wide enough for two cars to pass. "Boy, I'd hate to fall off the edge of this road," Frank remarked. "It's 100-foot drop." "That's right," Joe agreed. "We'd sure be smashed to bits before we ever got to the bottom." Then he smiled. "Watch your step, Frank, or Dad's papers won't get delivered." Frank reached into his jacket pocket to be sure that several important legal papers, which he was to deliver for Mr. Hardy, were still there. Relieved to find them, Frank chuckled and said, "After the help we gave Dad on his latest case, he ought to set up the firm of Hardy and Sons." "Why not?" Joe replied with a broad grin. "Isn't he one of the most famous private detectives in the country? And aren't we bright, too?" Then, becoming serious, he added, "I wish we could solve a mystery on our own, though." Frank and Joe, students at Bayport High, were combining business with pleasure this Saturday morning by doing the errand for their father. Even though one boy was dark and the other fair, there was a marked resemblance between the two brothers. 18-year-old Frank was tall and dark. Joe, a year younger, was blond with blue eyes. They were the only children of Fenton and Laura Hardy. The family lived in Bayport, a small but thriving city of 50,000 inhabitants, located on Barmont Bay, 3 miles inland from the Atlantic Ocean. The two motorcycles whipped along the narrow road that skirted the bay and led to Willowville, the brothers' destination. The boys took the next curve neatly and started up a long, steep slope. Here the road was a mere ribbon and badly in need of repair. "Once we get to the top of this hill, it won't be so rough," Frank remarked as they jounced over the uneven surface. "Better road from there into Willowville." Just then, above the sharp putt-putt of their own motors, the two boys heard the roar of a car approaching from their rear at a great speed. They took a moment to glance back. "Looks like the same guy we saw before," Joe burst out. "Good night." At once the Hardys stopped and pulled close to the edge as they dared. Frank and Joe hopped off and stood poised to leap out of danger again if necessary. The car hurled toward them like a shot. Just when it seemed as if it could not miss them, the driver swung the wheel about viciously and the sedan sped past. "Phew, that was close," Frank gasped. The car had been traveling at such a high speed that the boys had been unable to get the license number or a glimpse of the driver's features. But they had noted that he was hatless and had a shock of red hair. "If I ever meet him again," Joe muttered, I'll. The boy was too excited to finish the threat. Frank relaxed. "He must be practicing for some kind of race," he remarked, as the dark blue sedan disappeared from sight around the curve ahead. The boys resumed their journey. By the time they rounded the curve and could see Willowville in a valley along the bay beneath them, there was no trace of the rash motorist. "He's probably halfway across the state by this time," Joe remarked. "Unless he's in jail or over a cliff," Frank added. The boys reached Willowville, and Frank delivered the legal papers to a lawyer while Joe guarded the motorcycles. When his brother returned, Joe suggested, "How about taking the other road back to Bayport? I don't crave going over that bumpy stretch again." "Suits me. We can stop off at Chet's." Chet Morton, who was a school chum of the Hardy boys, lived on a farm about a mile out of Bayport. The pride of Chet's life was a bright yellow jalopy which he had named Queen. He worked on it daily to soup up the engine. Frank and Joe retraced their trip for a few miles, then turned onto a country road which led to the main highway on which the Morton farm was situated. As they neared Chet's home, Frank suddenly brought his motorcycle to a stop and peered down into a clump of bushes in a deep ditch on the side of the road. "Joe, that crazy driver or somebody else had a crack up." Among the tall bushes was an overturned blue sedan. The car was a total wreck and lay wheels upward, a mass of tangled junk. "We better see if there's anyone underneath," Joe cried out. The boys made their way down the culvert, their hearts pounding. What would they find? A close look into the sedan and in the immediate vicinity proved that there was no victim around. "Maybe this happened some time ago," said Joe, and Frank stepped forward and laid his hand on the exposed engine. "Joe, it's still warm," he said. "The accident occurred a short while ago. Now, I'm sure this is the red-haired driver's car." "But what about him?" Joe asked. "Is he still alive? Did somebody rescue him? Or what happened?" Frank shrugged. "One thing I can tell you. Either he or somebody else removed the license plates to avoid identification." The brothers were completely puzzled by the whole affair. Since their assistance was not needed at the spot, they climbed out of the culvert and back onto their motorcycles. Before long, they were inside of the Mortons' home, a rambling old farmhouse with an apple orchard at the rear. When they drove up the lane, they saw Chet at the barnyard gate. "Hi, fella." Chet hurried down the lane to meet him. He was a plump boy who loved to eat and was rarely without an apple or a pocket of cookies. His round, freckled face usually wore a smile, but today the Hardys said something was wrong. As they brought their motorcycles to a stop, they noticed that their chum's cheery expression was missing. "What's the matter?" Frank asked. "I'm in trouble," Chet replied. "You're just in time to help me. Did you meet a fellow driving the Queen?" Frank and Joe looked at each other blankly. "Your car? No, we haven't seen it," said Joe. "What happened?" "It's been stolen." "Stolen?" "Yes. I just came out to the garage to get the Queen and she was gone." Chet answered mournfully. "Wasn't the car locked?" "That's the strange part of it. She was locked, although the garage door was open. I can't see how anyone got away with it." "A professional job," Frank commented. "Auto thieves are always carry scores of keys with them. Chet, have you any idea when this happened?" "Not more than 15 minutes ago, because that's when I came home with the car." "Where We're wasting time, Joe cried out. Let's chase that thief. But I don't know which way he went, Chet protested. Well, we didn't meet him, so he must have gone the other direction, Frank reasoned. Climb on behind me, Chet, Joe urged. The Queen can't go as fast as our motorcycles. We'll catch her in no time. And then there was only a little gas in my car anyway, Chet said excitedly as he swung himself onto Joe's motorcycle. Maybe it has stalled by this time. In a few moments, the boys were tearing down the road in pursuit of the automobile thief. Wow. Chapter 2. The Holdup. Chet Morton's jalopy was such a brilliant yellow that the boys were confident it would not be difficult to pick up the trail of the auto thief. The Queen's pretty well known around Bayport, Frank remarked. We should meet someone who saw it. Seems strange to me, said Joe, that a thief would take a car like that. Auto thieves usually take cars of a standard make and color. They're easier to get rid of. It's possible, Frank suggested, that the thief didn't steal the car to sell it. Maybe, for some reason, he was making a fast getaway and he abandoned it. Look, Chet exclaimed, pointing to a truck garden where several men were hoeing cabbage plants. Maybe they saw the Queen. I'll ask them, Frank offered, and brought his motorcycle to a stop. He scrambled over the fence and jumped across the rows of small plants until he reached the first farmhand. Did you see a yellow jalopy go by here within the past hour? Frank asked him. The lanky old farmer leaned on his hoe and put a hand to one ear. Eh? He shouted. Did you see a fellow pass along here in a bright yellow car? Frank repeated in a louder tone. The farmer called to his companions. As they ambled over, the old man removed a plug of tobacco from the pocket of his overalls and took a hearty chew. The lad here wants to know if we saw a jalopy come by, he said slowly. The other three farmhands, all rather elderly men, did not answer at once. Instead, they laid down their hoes, and the plug of tobacco was duly passed around the group. Frank grit his teeth. Please hurry up and answer. The car was stolen. We're trying to find the thief. That's so, said one of the men. Hot rod, eh? Yes, a bright yellow one, Frank replied. Another of the workers removed his hat and mopped his brow. Seems to me, he drawled, I did see a car come by here a while ago. A yellow car? No, 'tweren't yellow, come to think of it. I guess anyhow it was a delivery truck if I remember rightly. Frank strove to conceal his impatience. Please, did any of you... Was it a brand new car, real shiny? Asked the fourth member of the group. No, it was an old car, but it was painted bright yellow, Frank explained. My nephew had one of them things, the farmer remarked. Never thought they were safe myself. I don't agree with you, said another man spoke up. All boys like cars, and you might as well let 'em have one they can work on themselves. You're all wrong, the deaf man interrupted. Let the boys work on the farm truck. That way they won't get into mischief. He gave a cackling sort of laugh. Well, son, I guess we ain't been much help to you. Hope you find the critter that stole your hot rod. Thanks, said Frank, and joined the other boys. No luck. Let's go. As they approached Bayport, the trio saw a girl walking along the road ahead of them. When the cyclists drew near, Frank's face lighted up, for he recognized Callie Shaw, who was in his class at Bayport High. Frank often dated Callie and liked her better than any girl he knew. The boys brought their motorcycles to a stop, beside pretty brown-eyed Callie. Under one arm, she was carrying a slightly battered package, and she looked vexed. "Hi, Callie, what's the matter?" Frank asked. "You look as if your last friend had gone off in a moon rocket." Callie gave a mischievous smile. "How could I think that with you three friends showing up? Or are you about to take off?" Then her smile faded and she held out the damaged package. "Look at that!" she exclaimed. "It's your fault, Chet Morton." The stout boy gulped. "My fault? How do you figure that?" "Well, dear old Mrs. Willis down the road is ill, so I baked her a cake." "Lucky Mrs. Willis," Joe broke in. "Callie, I think I'm feeling terribly ill." Callie ignored it. "The man in the car came along here so fast I jumped to the side of the road and dropped my package. I'm afraid my cake is ruined." "What man?" Joe asked. "The one Chet lent his car to." "Callie, that's the man we're looking for," Frank exclaimed. "Chet didn't lend him the car, he stole it." "Oh," said Callie, shocked. "Chet, that's a shame." "Was he headed for Bayport?" Joe asked. "Yes, and at the speed he was making the poor Queen travel, you'll never catch him." Chet groaned. "I just remembered that the gas gauge wasn't working. I guess the car had more gas in it than I thought. No telling where the guy may take my Queen." "We better go to police headquarters," Frank suggested. "Callie, will you describe this man?" "All I saw," she answered, "was a blur, but the man did have red hair." "Red hair!" Frank fairly shouted. "Joe, do you think he could be the same man we saw? The one who wrecked his own car?" Joe wagged his head. "Miracles do happen. Maybe he wasn't hurt very much and walked to Chet's house." "And helped himself to my car," Chet added. Frank snapped his fingers. "Say, maybe the wrecked car didn't belong to that fellow." "You mean he's stolen it too?" Joe interrupted. "Yes, which would make him even more desperate to get away." "Whatever are you boys talking about?" Callie asked. "I'll phone you tonight and tell you," Frank promised. "Gotta dash now." The boys waved goodbye to Callie and hurried into town. They went at once to Chief Ezra Cawley, head of the Bayport police force. He was a tall, husky man, well known to Fenton Hardy and his two sons. The chief had often turned to the private detective for help in solving particularly difficult cases. When the boys went into his office, they found the police chief talking with three excited men. One of these men was Ike Harrity, the old ticket seller at the city ferry boat office. Another was policeman Con Riley. The third was Oscar Smuff, a short, stout man. He was invariably seen wearing a checkered suit and a soft felt hat. He called himself a private detective and was working hard to earn a place on the Bayport police force. "Schmuff's playing up to calling again," Joe whispered, chuckling as the boys waited for the chief to speak to them. Ike Harrity was frightened. He was a timid man who had perched high on a high stool behind the ticket window at the ferry boat office day in and day out for a good many years. "I was just counting up the morning receipts," he was saying in a high pitched, excited voice, "when in comes this fellow and sticks a revolver in front of my nose." "Just a minute," interrupted Chief Cawley, turning to the newcomers. "What can I do for you boys?" "I came to report a theft," Chet spoke up. "My hot rod's been stolen." "Why, it was one of those crazy hot rods this fellow drove," Ike Harrity cried out. "A yellow one." "Ha!" exclaimed Oscar Smuff. "A clue." He immediately pulled out a pencil and notebook from his pocket. "My Queen!" shouted Chet. Chief Cawley rapped on his desk for quiet and asked, What's a queen got to do with all this? Chet explained. Then the chief related Harity's story for him. A man drove up to the ferry boat office and tried to hold up Mr. Harity, but a passenger came into the office and the fellow ran away. As the officer paused, Frank gave Chief Collig a brief account of the wrecked blue sedan near the Morton farm. "I'll send some men over there right now." The chief pressed a buzzer and quickly relayed his orders. "It certainly looks," Joe commented, "as if the man who stole Chet's car and the fellow who tried to hold up the ferry boat office are the same person." "Did you notice the color of the man's hair?" Frank asked Mr. Harity. Smuff interrupted. "What's that got to do with it?" "It may have a great deal to do with it," Frank replied. "What was the color of his hair, Mr. Harity?" "Dark brown and short cropped." Frank and Joe looked at each other perplexed. "You sure it wasn't red?" Joe asked. Chief Collig sat forward in his chair. "What are you driving at, boys? Have you some information about this man?" "We were told," said Joe, "that the guy who stole Chet's car had red hair. A friend of ours saw him. Then he must have turned the jalopy over to someone else," Chief Collig concluded. At this moment, a short, nervous little man was ushered into the room. He was the passenger who had gone into the ferry boat office at the time of the attempted holdup. Chief Collig had sent for him. The newcomer introduced himself as Henry J. Brown of New York. He told of entering the office and seeing a man run away from the ticket window with a revolver in his hand. "What color was his hair?" Frank asked eagerly. "Did you notice?" "Can't say I did," the man replied. "My eyes were focused on that gun. Say, wait a minute. He had red hair. You couldn't miss it. I noticed after he jumped into the car." Oscar Smuff looked bewildered. "You say he had red hair?" The detective turned to Mr. Harrod. "You say he had dark hair. Something's wrong somewhere." He shook his head in puzzlement. The others were puzzled too. Frank asked Mr. Brown to tell once more just when he had noticed the red hair. "After the fellow leaned down in the car and popped his head up again," the New Yorker replied. Frank and Joe exchanged glances. Was it possible the red hair was a wig and the thief had put it on just before Mr. Brown had noticed him? The boys kept still. They didn't want any interference from Smuff in tracking down this clue. Harity and Brown began to argue over the color of the thief's hair. Finally, the chief colleague had to rap once more for order. "I'll send out an alarm for both this hold-up man and for Chet's car. I guess that's all that can be done now." Undaunted by their failure to catch the thief, the Hardy boys left police headquarters with Chet at Morton. They were determined to pursue the case. "We'll talk with Dad tonight, Chet," Frank promised. "Maybe he'll give us some leads." "I sure hope so, fellows," their friend replied as they climbed onto the motorcycles. The same thought was running through Frank and Joe's minds. Maybe this mystery would turn out to be their first case. No part of this episode may be reproduced without my personal permission. Railfan Roberts Reading Railroad is a production of Raccoon Gaming Rails Railroad Productions. And all podcast episodes are owned by Raccoon Gaming Rails Railroad Productions.